Salve omnes, this is the lecture for chapter 15 for Latin for the new millennium, level 2. In this chapter, we are learning the gerund, the gerundive, and the passive periphrastic. All right, the gerund. The gerund is a verbal noun. So as a verbal noun, it's going to have qualities of a verb, and it's also going to have qualities of a noun. So like a noun, it is going to decline. Like a verb, it is active in meaning. So this corresponds to the English gerund, right? These are our ing verbs, those running, dancing, singing. Those are all examples of gerunds. The gerund exists in 4 forms, okay? It exists in the neuter singular, in the genitive, the dative, the accusative, and the ablative. In Latin, we call these oblique cases. So basically, any case that's not the nominative case is an oblique case. This is what the declension of the gerund looks like. Now, you'll note that for the nominative, I have put a form, and technically, the nominative is the infinitive. The infinitive in Latin is a verbal noun, and it is a neuter verbal noun. But what we need to really be focusing on here is what's happening in these oblique cases. So the genitive form is laudandi, the dative is laudando, the accusative, which we will almost always see with the preposition ad, would be laudandum, and the ablative would be laudando. I've also given you here an example of a third conjugation, just so you can see it. Ducendi, ducendo, ducendum, and then ducendo. So what you're noticing, hopefully here, is that the gerund is, in fact, the future passive participle. They're one and the same, essentially. So the gerund is the future passive participle. And if you remember how we formed the future passive participle, we formed it by taking our second principal part and then adding the letters ndus, or nd really, and then we just added us, to the ending, right? That was when it was functioning like an adjective, right? It was functioning as a participle. Now we're looking more at the noun endings of this participle. And again, it's taking neuter singular endings. So, the gerund. In order to decline the gerund, what you're going to do is you're going to take the future passive participle, you're going to give it neuter singular endings, and you're done. Okay, talk a little bit about uses of the different cases of the gerund. So the genitive gerund is going to show up with nouns or adjectives in Latin that normally take the genitive. So, for example, the adjective studium, right? If you have a fondness, like the noun studium, you have a fondness of living. So, studium vivendi cum amicus. He has a fondness of living with friends. And so you'll see that what I'm doing with my translation is I'm translating the gerund like a gerund in English. I'm just turning it into an ing verb. The dative gerund is going to be used to indicate the purpose of the action of that main clause. So the sentence operam dat vivendo bene. He gives attention to living well. Okay, you'll note here that I'm translating it with the helping word to, and then I've got my ing word. He gives attention to living well. The accusative, again, the accusative gerund is often going to show up with the preposition ad. It's used to indicate the purpose of the action. Athenas iit ad vivendum bene. He went to Athens to live well. You'll see that this is actually very similar to the supine, the accusative supine. And then finally, the ablative gerund is used to express means or instrument. Feliciores fimus vivendo bene. We become happier by living well. So again, gerund can exist in 4 different cases: the genitive, the dative, the accusative, and the ablative. It's essentially doing in each case what each case does, but we can be a little bit more precise to say that the genitive gerund, again, showing up with nouns or adjectives that take the genitive. Dative gerund is used to indicate the purpose of the action. Accusative gerund used to indicate purpose of the action, but this is going to be showing up with the preposition ad. And then the ablative gerund showing means or instrument. Okay, now we're going to go from the gerund to the gerundive. And this is where your life is going to get a little bit complicated. The gerundive is also the future passive participle. But what makes the gerundive different from the gerund is that the gerundive is an adjective. Look, they rhyme. So gerundive is an adjective, meaning it will always be modifying a noun. So Puella Amanda, a girl worth loving, right? A girl who ought to be loved. From the gerundive, we are going to be forming the passive periphrastic, which we're going to talk about in a few more slides. Okay, so to compare them, gerundive, adjective. Gerund is a noun. Because the gerundive is an adjective, it's going to show up in the masculine, the feminine, the neuter. It can be singular or plural, and it shows up in every single case. The gerundive is also passive in meaning. The gerund only shows up in the neuter singular, only shows up in our oblique cases. It is active in meaning, and because it's active, it can take a direct object. Okay. The book has the following statement. The gerund changes into a gerundive, taking the gender and the number of the direct object. But the former direct object now agrees with the case of the gerund. This construction, made up of a noun with the gerundive agreeing with it as an adjective, is normally used instead of a gerund with an object. This is one of those sentences you read in your head, kind of does something like this. Okay, so let's kind of dissect a little bit what the book is trying to tell you. Essentially what the book is saying is Latin, if it can use a gerundive instead of a gerund, it's going to do that. Generally speaking, Latin won't have a gerund taking a direct object, right? I know that gerunds can take direct objects. For example, in this sentence, we will learn by reading books. Okay, we will learn, here's my ablative gerundive means, by reading books, okay? Books functioning there as my direct object. This is what English would normally say, right? We learn by reading books. Latin, though, won't do this if it can do it a different way. So, what this statement is telling you is that Latin would actually prefer to say this. We will learn by books being read. Discemus libris legendis. So in other words, what just happened is my gerund here, legendo, has now become a gerundive, right? It is now an adjective in the passive modifying a noun. Discemus libris legendis. We will learn by books being read. In English, we would actually probably still just translate this as we will learn by reading books. So this whole confusing sentence in the textbook, all it's telling you is that if Latin can use either a gerund or a gerundive, it's going to want to use a gerundive. So again, just to compare, this first sentence is a gerund. The second sentence is a gerundive. How do I know I have a gerundive? Well, for one, it's in the plural. Gerund doesn't exist in the plural. And two, it's an adjective, right? It's modifying a noun. The gerund is not an adjective. It is just a verbal noun. So a couple more examples. The phrase studium legendi libros, right? Literally a fondness of reading books, okay? That's the gerund, legendi. Legendi is a verbal noun taking a direct object. This is acceptable, but what's preferred in Latin is what we see happening at letter B. Studium librorum legendorum, right? Now I have a gerundive, right? Legendorum in the genitive, plural, modifying librorum. Again, another example down here. A, which is acceptable, discimus legendo libros, right? We learn by reading books, but again, the preferred statement, discimus libris legendis, right? That gerundive is going to be the preferred form in Latin. Some common uses of the gerund and the gerundive, again, as we talked about, ad plus the accusative, either the gerund or the gerundive phrase, to express purpose. Venet ad legendum libros, venet ad libros legendos, right? He came to read books, or he came for the purpose of reading books. Post-positive causa plus the genitive, gerund, or gerundive phrase is also used to express purpose. So sentences here, otium petit legendi libros causa. Okay, remember that a post-positive means that it is something that is literally placed after, right? Post, after, and then positive coming from the verb pono, ponere posui, positum. So causa here is a postpositive. It is being placed after my gerund. He seeks leisure for the sake of reading books. Again, the sentence constructed with a gerundive, which again, Latin would prefer to do. Otium petit librorum legendorum causa. Again, remembering that causa in Latin takes the genitive. Look at a few example sentences. Atenas moeniis oppugnandis capiamus. Take a second. Even if you can't translate the sentence immediately, see if you can identify either the gerund or the gerundive and determine, is it a gerund or is it a gerundive? All right. So sentence, let us seize Athens. Did you note that use of the subjunctive in the main verb? Right. So let us seize Athens by attacking the walls. Okay. This is an example of the gerundive. How do I know it's a gerundive? It's plural. The gerund is never plural. And more important, it is acting as an adjective, modifying the noun moeniis. Mulier fructuum vendendorum causa ad urbem ambulat. Again, see if you can find our gerund slash gerundive and then see if you can figure out, is it a gerund or a gerundive? So translation, the woman, mulier, walks ad urbem to the city to or for the purpose of, there's my causa, selling fruits. Another example of a gerundive. Vendendorum, okay, modifies fructuum and it is used to indicate purpose in this case because of the causa. Ad injuriam corandam ad medicum addiit. He goes to the doctor to have his injury healed. So here's an example of ad plus the accusative, right? He goes to the doctor for the sake of, for the purpose of healing the injury. Another example of a gerundive because corandam modifies injuriam. Roma abibunt ad peregrinandum Syracusas. They will depart from Rome. Again, note the use of Roma in the ablative without a preposition, meaning place from which, to travel to Syracuse. This is an example of a gerund, okay? Peregrinandum doesn't modify any other word in the sentence. It's in the neuter. It's in the singular. It's a gerund. Pernoctandi causa domum iniunt. They are coming home to spend the night, right? They're coming home for the sake of sleeping through the night. Per nocto. An example here of the gerund. Pauca opera mihi sedendi fiunt multa agendo et experiendo. To me, few deeds are accomplished by sitting, many by acting and trying. So sedendo, agendo, and experiendo, they're all examples of gerunds. The way you're going to note a gerund and a gerundive beyond just knowing what a future passive participle looks like is going to be with that nd ending. As you can see, the gerund, right, ends with nd, and that's the letter that is showing up in the future passive participle. Okay, the passive periphrastic. The passive periphrastic is going to be made up of a gerundive, again also known as the future passive participle, plus the form of the verb to be. Okay, the gerundive is going to act as a predicate adjective, so it's going to agree with the subject of the verb sum in case, number, and gender. Okay, how do I translate it? The passive periphrastic is used in Latin to denote obligation or necessity. So it literally is going to translate as the noun is to be verbed. It's often idiomatically translated with words like must, should, or ought. Okay, some examples of the passive periphrastic. Haec femina laudanda est. Okay, so here's my gerundive, also known as my future passive participle, also known as the second principal part, plus the letters nd, plus the verb to be. Translation, this woman is to be praised, or this woman must be praised. This woman should be praised. This woman ought to be praised. The dative of agent. This is a very exciting new use of the dative of agent. So with most passive verbs, as you guys know, we use an ablative of agent with the preposition a or ab. But with the passive periphrastic, agent is going to be expressed by using the dative case. The dative with the passive periphrastic can sometimes be a little bit awkward to translate. So sometimes it's actually better to translate the passive periphrastic as though it were active and then turning the dative of agent into the subject. So, for example, Haec puella meo filio amanda est. All right. This girl ought to be loved. Okay, amanda est. There's my passive periphrastic. Meo filio is my dative of agent. Note the lack of ob or any kind of preposition because it's the dative, right? This girl ought to be loved by my son. We might more idiomatically translate it as my son ought to, should, must love this girl. And that does it for chapter 15. Walete.